in Beirut, where the U.S. Special Envoy Amos Hochstein is holding talks for a second day. He's hoping to make progress for a potential ceasefire deal between Israel and Hezbollah, though the Lebanese group has expressed doubts about Israel's commitments.
What Hochstein has said from his viewpoint gives us some hope that a ceasefire is achievable. We're focusing on the battlefield and leaving negotiations to Speaker Berri. However, we know Israel's strategy in negotiations with Hamas, putting the blame always on Hamas and holding them continuously responsible for the collapse, while the whole world knows that Netanyahu is and has always been undermining any positive outcome.
Several Lebanese soldiers have been killed by Israeli strikes during Hochstein's visit. One strike hit the south on Wednesday morning. In another strike, 3 Lebanese soldiers were killed at a base in Sarafand on Tuesday. Let's get more on all this from Zeina Khodr in Beirut. Zeina, you're following these negotiations. There appears to be some movement, incremental movement, hard to quantify, obviously. But if you pull all the threads together, right? Hezbollah, Israel, the Lebanese prime minister, the Lebanese speaker of parliament, all of this together, where do we stand right now?
Well, it may be a bit too early to say that a ceasefire deal is imminent, but there is no doubt there has been progress. Now, the U.S. envoy Amos Hochstein held overnight talks with aides to the Speaker of Parliament, Nabih Berri. This is what we understand. They were trying to narrow the differences, if you like. Lebanon had some concerns with this U.S. draft ceasefire proposal. They say they've been dealing with it openly and they welcome it and they've been flexible, but they had some concerns. So there were overnight meetings. In half an hour from now, Amos Hochstein is expected to arrive here at Berri's residence. It will be their second meeting in as many days. And then we are expected to hear from the U.S. envoy. So that main sticking point is the enforcement mechanism of UN Resolution 1701. When Hochstein was here last in October, in late October, he did tell Lebanese officials, your commitment to implement UN Resolution 1701 is just not enough because you failed to do that over the past 18 or so years, since 2006 when it was adopted. So Israel is demanding an enforcement mechanism. So what we are understanding is that Lebanon could accept a U.S. role in overseeing the implementation of this resolution, which calls on Hezbollah to pull back from the border, its military infrastructure pulled back from the border, and that the Lebanese army extends the state's authority along the border alongside UN troops. So a U.S. role apparently will be acceptable to the Lebanese side and most likely to the Israeli side as well. We are hearing reports that this was, one of the conditions of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. But still, this is where there's cautious optimism. We don't know Israel's position.
Zeina, okay. I'd like to we're going to cover some of the same ground again, because I think it's really important for our viewers to understand this. What the discussion is about really is about a UN resolution, 1701. Our viewers will have heard those numbers many times, 1701. This was in a UN resolution, or it's the name number of a UN resolution that was passed in 2006, 18 years ago. And it provided for the withdrawal of Hezbollah from southern Lebanon and the disarming of Hezbollah. So what you're telling us is they're now discussing how to implement a text that was passed by the U.S. 18 years ago, but not effectively implemented. Have I got this right?
Yes, but I also have to point out something. The Lebanese side, Lebanon's officials, especially those who hold power, are allied to Hezbollah. They don't believe this resolution calls for the disarmament of Hezbollah. They believe it calls for Hezbollah pulling back from the border north of the Litani River. Over the past 24 hours, we saw 2 Israeli strikes on Lebanese army positions, killing 4 Lebanese army soldiers. The timing of this attack, it's not the first time they've attacked them, even though they've been staying on the sidelines of this conflict. The timing could be seen as a message from Israel that we do not trust the Lebanese army to carry out this mission alone, because the Lebanese army will not confront Hezbollah. And that's why the enforcement mechanism is the sticking point. Who is going to ensure that Hezbollah does not build up its military infrastructure along the border and to push back north of the Litani River? Now, the issue of Hezbollah's weapons, it may be too early to even discuss that. But Israel, through their statements that their officials are making, they believe that they have weakened the group. And the group has been weakened. There's no doubt. They've lost their political leadership. They've lost a lot of military commanders. But Israel, too, has an interest in ending what could be a prolonged war of attrition, to stop the rocket fire across the border and allow people in northern Israel and central Israel to resume their daily lives. So this is where the negotiations are centering on, to find a way to implement that. Now, we heard Hezbollah officials, and I think this is very important, talk about trusting Berri to ensure that any deal will not violate Lebanon's sovereignty. So, but could this, a U.S. role, how will that be seen by some of its supporters? So we're still at the very beginning, but it seems that there has been some progress.
Yeah, there's a lot of trust involved in everything you've described. Trusting the Americans, trusting the Lebanese Speaker of Parliament. Okay, you're on top of these negotiations. As soon as you have something new to report, we'll be talking to you. Zeina Khodr reporting from Beirut. Thank you so much. Daniel Levy is the president of the U.S. Middle East Project. You're also a former advisor in the Israeli Prime Minister's office, and you're joining us from London. Thank you for your time today, Daniel. Your thoughts, first of all, on these ceasefire, I hesitate to call them negotiations, but talks, at least, indirect talks between Israel and Hezbollah.
Well, what we've seen thus far, and we're awaiting perhaps some new announcements today, but what we have seen is Israel trying to achieve via its American proxy in these talks what it could not achieve on the battlefield. So Israel has not been, yes, damage done to Hezbollah. Israel has not been able to achieve this total victory despite all the destruction in Gaza and despite the destruction in Lebanon. Israel seems to, again, taking a page out of a book we're familiar with, Israel seems to have placed into the negotiations some poisoned pills. The specific one here would seem to be its freedom of operation, something where you violate, in an agreement, another state's sovereignty, in this case Lebanon, with the freedom to operate in that state. I don't think that is something that could be part of any deal, but the American administration is happy to carry Israel's water on this front. Now, either it's a red herring that they'll remove, or it's a way of making sure that the negotiations will not succeed, that they can rely on America and its Western allies to blame the other side. And I think whether it's a red herring or not is what we might find out in the coming days, and whether Israel does want to dial down on the Lebanon front while maintaining what it's doing in Gaza, and that is getting worse, as we know, and testing whether it can de-link those two fronts.
Daniel, what you say is really interesting. You raise the possibility that perhaps, I'm paraphrasing, so correct me if you feel I'm not saying it right, but that perhaps Israel is not negotiating in earnest. You mentioned the word poison pill, and that perhaps this is a smokescreen, and Israel is giving the appearance of talking about a ceasefire when they really have no intention of engaging in one. Have I got that right?
So when you have a mediator that is never willing to call you out as the recalcitrant, rejectionist party, it always leaves that option open for you, right? And it means you can go into this and say, let me test. What is the maximum I can get for this? And Israel has created expectations in its own public which cannot be met. And if I cannot get that maximum, I can comfortably say, oh, well, we tried, it's the other side's fault. Isn't it, Washington? And Washington will always align and say, yes, even though they know that's not the case, even though they're the ones in the talks, they will align with you, and not just align with you, but importantly, they will maintain your ability to militarily continue to pursue what you are doing at great cost, of course, to Lebanese civilians, in this case, medical workers, aid workers, the destruction there, I would argue at cost to America's reputation, but let's park that for a moment. So, yeah, I think Israel basically is looking at this and saying both options are open. If we can get delinkage, if we can get some of the things we want. The other thing I just throw into the mix, is that Israel is going to be drawn further into a ground invasion if these talks don't work out. Israel does have an issue with the losses it is incurring. It does have an issue with the strains placed upon its reservists. And I think it would be okay with saying, dial that down, but maintain the horrors in Gaza. So there is an option here for a deal. The question is whether Israel will accept something that is short of its maximalism when it knows it can pursue these things in other ways, given the American position.
I think one could argue pretty easily that Israel does not have a great track record in Lebanon going back 50 years, right? They invaded the country multiple times. They tried regime change. I'm talking about the 70s and 80s here. They've killed multiple Hezbollah leaders. By the way, Hassan Nasrallah was not the first. And all of this has not achieved lasting security. I mean, lasting security along Israel's northern border. Should Israel rethink its approach to Lebanon, in your view?
Very important point you raise. I mean, first, it's interesting to hear in all this reporting and what the Americans are saying about how do we get serious implementation of UN resolutions and enforcement mechanisms. Well, that's interesting. Since when is Israel interested in implementing UN resolutions and seeing enforcement mechanisms? That's, of course, what they ride roughshod over all the time when it comes to their occupation of Palestine. But if one takes that question that you asked and zooms out, absolutely, there is an Israeli position that seems to think that if not by force, then by more force. If not by killing, then by more killing. If not by destruction, then by more destruction. Israel can somehow be hegemonic, secure, and maintain a regime of ethnic supremacy over the Palestinians and a regime of fear over other surrounding states, including Lebanon, rather than stepping back and saying, if we are going to live in peace in this region, we will have to come to terms with the fact that other peoples in this region have rights, will need to have those rights realized and secured if we are going to live in security. But that has become antithetical to actual existing Zionism as practiced by the State of Israel, which is a danger to itself and, of course, to all of those around it.
Daniel Levy, president of the U.S. Middle East Project, thank you so much for your time and thanks for joining us on the Al Jazeera News Hour.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.